Okay, today we're speaking about greenhouse produce, and from a Kashrus perspective, there are basically two different ways to grow vegetables in a greenhouse. First one is that the vegetables are basically growing in the ground like in any other field, but this growing area is covered with a greenhouse. It keeps out the elements, it probably keeps out some bugs also, and helps. Basically, it's helping the farmer make an environment that's just better for growth. So, in short, it's a glass box on top of the field, and for our purposes, this has no significance. It doesn't change anything of anything we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about is the second type of greenhouse, which we associate with hydroponic growth, although that's not the only way to use it. And basically, the nursery, which is where the plants first begin to grow, and the final growing area are in a greenhouse. It has a solid floor, it has a solid roof, it has walls, and actually there's a more modern variation of that is the whole growth is indoors. It's not even outdoors at all. It's inside of could be inside of a warehouse, and there's not even any sunlight in there. Even the so to speak sunlight is artificial. This more modern version is called vertical farming. But either types of these, both of these variations of the same thing is what Chazal would call an otish and a nakav. I mean, the plant is growing in an otish, in a flower pot that has no hole, meaning it doesn't draw any nutrition from the ground outside. Everything is growing just from what's there in this, so to speak, flower pot. Now, and we're going to be talking, that's what we're going to be focusing on, this second type. Now, just as sort of an aside is that in some of these cases, the growth media, meaning that what the plant is actually sitting in, could be something inert, like water or some other kinds of unusual, different growth media. And it's possible to argue that those are even less than Otzeshen and Akav, because there isn't even any ground at all. Forget about that, it's not in the ground, the earth, literally outside in the earth, but it might not be in earth altogether. But for today's discussion, we're going to ignore that possibility and just assume it has the status of an Otzeshen and Akav, and we're going to speak about what effect that has and whether that makes any difference. Okay, now one caveat is that when we talk about these things that grow in these special types of greenhouses or in the vertical farming, we're talking about situations where the entire growth from beginning to end happened in this Otzeshen and Nakav, in this special area. In order to say, to assume any special statuses like we're going to speak about, you have to know that that's actually happened. And there wasn't, like, for example, there are places where the nursery is a regular growth and then it moves to a greenhouse or the other way around. So you'd have to know that this is for sure what's happened. Okay, so our first subject is of these, within these types of greenhouses, has to do with insects. And that is, a different time when we spoke about Torah, we said that this basic rule that sheretz ha'aretz, a land-based insect, is not usher unless it is either born attached to the ground or moved or walked on the ground. Okay, so just being an insect is not enough to be usher. It has to have either been born on the ground or moved on the ground. Now, there's a machlokes in the Practicum. What happens if you have an insect that was born in an Otzeshen nakav? Was that considered that it was born on the ground? Meaning, on the one hand, the plant is attached to the soil. It's in dirt. It's in a flower pot in dirt. On the other hand, that dirt is not part of the earth, so to speak, the outdoors. I don't know how we call this. The outdoors. So it didn't really grow in the earth per se. Okay, and so there's a question about, is that considered that it grew attached to the ground or not attached to the ground for this thing? Now, that's a machlokes Practicum. A different time when we spoke about Torah, we also saw that when we had there are different levels of infestation that a vegetable or a fruit could have. Some of them are so little you don't have to check at all. Some of them are so terrible, we call them muchse. We know for sure that there are bugs in it, and that's midoraisa, you're required to check it. But most of the things that we have tend to be in this middle category, which is there's a certain amount of infestation, but it's not very terribly common. We call that a miyad hamatzui. And in those cases, midrabanan, you have to check it. Now, if the whole requirement to check is a drabanan, then that gives us more basis for relying on the lenient opinion about Otzeshen and Nakav. Again, if you hold that, according to those that hold that growing in an Otzeshen and Nakav is not considered growing attached to the ground, then a bug that grew over there is not usher, just because it's there, or even if it moves around within that vegetable itself, it's not usher because it moved around, not attached to the ground. So if an item is infested only to the level of miyat matzuri, there would be, and it grew in this type of greenhouse, which is an atzer she'ein nakav, or vertical farming, then there would all of a sudden be basis for saying that maybe it makes no difference whether the bug is there, because even if it's there, it might not be usher altogether. Now, we're talking about situations like this where we're not sure whether the bug walked on the ground or not. We're not sure whether it did or didn't, go from place to place. But there's one place where we can be very sure, 100%, where we know that it did not, and that is for a kind of an insect called a leaf miner, when it grew in an atzer she'ein nakav. For a leaf miner, it's a kind of an insect where a kind of insect that lays its eggs inside of a leaf. Like between the layers of a leaf, or inside of something like a piece of celery. And when the baby is the baby insect is born, hatches from this egg, it stays inside this space that's between the layers of the leaf, or in the parts of a celery, and it moves horizontally, meaning it moves across without breaking out of the leaf or the scallion or the onion or the celery. It stays within the plant, and it doesn't leave. And then after a certain amount of time, it's grown to a big enough size. It sort of eats its way through, it gets its nutrition by eating its way through the leaf, again, without breaking out to the outside. And eventually, it pops out, makes a hole, and leaves and goes on its merry way. So if we have a leaf miner let's say in a scallion or in a leaf, then we know that it has never left its home base, its birthplace. It's always been in that spot. So then if we're in an atzer she'ein nakav, then we know that it has never left its place, and we would be able to say that it growing in an atzer she'ein nakav, we know it wasn't growing attached to the ground, according to the lenient opinion, and it never left, and therefore that would be mutter also. Now, sort of a separate thing is that, when a person is required to check, let's say, I don't know, pick up a head of lettuce, so there's a chiyuv drabanan to check it to make sure there's no insects in it. The din is very clear that it doesn't help to check some of it or even most of the lettuce. You have to check it all. You have to check every bit. You cannot sample some of it and decide that it's okay based on that. There are very specific, limited situations where sampling is okay. And one of those examples is for produce that grew in one of these greenhouses. And that is like this. In this case, we're not checking to see if there are bugs on the lettuce or the other vegetable that grew here. Rather, what we're doing is there are all kinds of controls set up to make sure that no bugs get into the greenhouse, all kinds of nettings and controls about the doors and the inlets and the outlets and the air and the water. All kinds of things are checked and made sure that no bugs get into this area. So the checking of the sample is a way to make sure were we successful in what we did to keep the bugs out. And by checking a sample, we can figure out, is this like regular lettuce out in the fields where we find X amount of bugs, or is it not like that because we did a very good job? So that's an example of where sampling is okay, but otherwise, sampling is not enough to know that a vegetable or something else doesn't have bugs inside of it. Okay, now let's move to something away from bug questions and to the bracha. And that is, there's a big, considerable discussion in Practicum about what the bracha should be on vegetables or fruits that grew in hydroponically. And one of the major parts of that discussion is that maybe the bracha should be shahakol instead of hadama, because they grew in an atzer she'ein nakav, and therefore that you can't say a bracha bari pri hadama. This is the produce of the land, when this didn't grow in the land. It grew in an atzer she'ein nakav, which is, as we've seen, is not necessarily considered part of the ground. Now, Rosh Zalman Auerbach and others said that Chazal said the bracha for tomatoes and cucumbers, these kind of things, is hadama. They weren't trying to be so specific that every single sample has to have grown in the hadama. That's the bracha for this food. And even if this particular one happens to have not grown in the ground, it doesn't make a difference. It's still the bracha of a cucumber is hadama. In contrast to that, the Chayodim says that this question about what bracha to make on produce of an atzer she'ein nakav is a question in the Yerushalmi, and therefore because of this question of what the bracha is, the Yerushalmi doesn't resolve that question. So the Chayadim said you should make a shahakal if it grew an Atzah Shein Nagav, and Rav Schwartz thought that was correct, and that's what a person should do. Now, so this is a question what the bracha is. So Rav David Oppenheimer pointed out like this. The reason why we're making a shahakal, those who make a shahakal on this produce from Atzah Shein Nagav, essentially they're doing it is because of Safek brachas lahakal. We don't know if the bracha should be hadama or shahakal, based on the Yerushalmi. And therefore, we make the simpler bracha rather than the more specific bracha. We make the shahak instead of hadam. So he says, so what would happen if earlier in that same meal, I made a hadama on a regular vegetable? No, let's say my tomatoes grew in Atzah Shein Nagav, but my cucumbers didn't. Then I made a hadama on the cucumbers. Well, now I have a question. Did that hadama cover the tomatoes or they didn't cover them? Well, at this point, Safek Brachas Lahakal says, you don't make a new bracha. So in that case, you would not recite shahakal on this produce because it's already been the Safek brachas lahakal at this point says make no bracha rather than says make the shahakal. So that's an interesting point, and it means is therefore it's an interesting point. And according to this, it would mean is that if a person eats romaine lettuce at the seder, which grew in an Atzah Shein Nagav. So we'll talk about in a second whether you can or can't do that. But assuming a person is eating that from Marror at the seder, then they would not make a shahaka when they eat that Marror, and that's because when they ate karpas way back early in the seder, they made hadama. They've now made a hadama, which potentially covers this food over here. And eating this food is now it's now Safek Brachas Lahakal tells us not to make a shahakal. That means even if you don't think that the hamaitzi of the matzah covers it, it's covered because the hadama of the karpas covers this. Even if you would make a shahakal on this, because again you're making a shahakal only because of Safek Brachas Lahakal, and since from that perspective you've already been covered. Okay. Now, so our next thing, which is related to what we just spoke about, is whether you can use hydroponically grown produce for the seder to eat for Marror. And it goes as follows. The Chazon Ish shows from a Gemara, which is very clear, that wheat that grew in an Atzah Shein Nagav can be used to make matzahs to eat at the Seder. So the question is, wait a second, there's another Gemara, a few blot later, which says that matzah has to be gidulei karka. Well, so what does that mean? If matzah has to be gidulei karka, and growing in an Atzah Shein Nagav is not growing in the ground, then how could it be used? How could you use it for the Seder? So Iglital says, that's a raya that the Gemara, the Bavli, is arguing on this Yerushalmi that we mentioned beforehand. The Bavli holds that even if you grow an Atzah Shein Nagav, it is considered to have grown on the ground. So it has to be Gedulei Karka, that's true, and you could use it for the Seder because the Bavli is saying it is Gedulei Karka. So he would be arguing on what Chayadim said beforehand that he would agree that the Yerushalmi has a question about it, but that the Bavli is confident that it's considered to have grown on the ground. But so what will the Chayadim and those other ones? What will they say? They say it's like this: that this Gemara is specific. This that it says it has to be Gedulei Karka is specific to matzah and Marror. The reasons for that is beyond our scope for today. But even so, there's a special reason why it has to be Gedulei Karka, but that has nothing to do with making it that it's still perfectly kosher for the mitzvah. It is still the same suffix whether we're outside. Whether that's considered, whether brachas wise might be the same suffix, but as far as using it for the mitzvah, you're allowed to. Now, if you're allowed to use matzah like in Atzah Shein Nagav, the din of Marror, it's related to it, and therefore, based on this Gemara that the Chazon Ish shows us, it is perfectly acceptable to use romaine that grew in Atzah Shein Nagav. To use it as for Marror at the Seder. Even if you think the bracha is shahakal, you'll still be allowed to use it. Okay, one last thing that we're not going to speak about is that in our discussions about Shemitah, we saw that there are Practicum who say that there are those who say that if you planting that goes on in a true Atzah Shein Nagav, in a greenhouse that's designed properly as Atzah Shein Nagav, is excused and is not included in the halachas of Shemitah. And therefore, there are actually farmers who follow that or variations of that in order to be able to do their production during Shemitah, following the din, but doing it in a special way.